I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To discuss a recent congressional delegation to Israel, we have with us Representative Brad Schneider, who is currently in his fifth term representing the 10th District of Illinois in the U.S. House of Representatives. Congressman Schneider presently serves on the House Ways and Means Committee and House Foreign Affairs Committee. He is also known as an expert on the Middle East, in particular the U.S.-Israel relationship, and he's the co-founder and co-chair of the bipartisan Abraham Accords Caucus. Representative Schneider, thank you so much for your time today, and welcome to The Truth of the Matter.
Glad to be here.
In April, you went on a congressional delegation to Israel. Can you tell us about the trip, why you went, and what were your takeaways at the time, and how we'll get into what's going on now in the current news, but what did you see when you were there?
Actually, it was March, and it was a congressional trip. I was joined by three other of my colleagues. We met on part of the trip with another delegation of 4 members. So in the official part of the meetings with the prime minister, other elected officials, there were 8 of us. And the purpose of that trip really was to see firsthand how Israel was dealing with the aftermath of October 7th, the impact on the society. I've got to go back a step to a trip in February, a personal trip I took with my wife and some of the community in Chicago. Very short trip. We were there for 3.5 days, but this was unofficial, and it was a chance to meet with civilian populations in Israel. We visited Nir Oz kibbutz, other areas that were affected by the attack on October 7th directly, and then spoke with members in the community, groups that were working to provide assistance and support to those directly affected, as well as folks, for example, people who had lived on Nir Oz who had survived the attack. This was a small kibbutz of 400 people right on the border with Gaza. It was uninhabitable. They're now living in Kiryat Gat, which happens to be the sister city of Chicago. So in that first trip, I met with the civil population, didn't meet with any officials. This official trip in March was much more to get a sense of how the government and the state was responding to these attacks. And so we had a chance to, again, visit Nir Oz. First day we were there, we visited the Gaza area, kibbutzim, as well as the music festival, the Nova Music Festival site, which is now really just a sorrowful monument, solemn in the same way I think that people would describe battlefields from the Civil War, World War II. This was not so much a battlefield, but a massacre where 360 young people were brutally tortured, raped, murdered, their dead bodies mutilated and burned. It was really horrific. We traveled up to the north. We're on the border with Lebanon, saw the threats there. Then we had meetings with the prime minister, President Herzog, Benny Gantz, others to talk about the official response. So it was a short trip, 4.5 days. But over the course of that time, we had a chance to really take in so much of what was happening in a period of both severe crisis and pressure on Israel, but hopefully, when we get to the other side, an opportunity to chart a different course for the future.
Did you find the people in Israel that you met with to be resilient, defeated, depressed, or somehow just, really trying to move forward as Israel as a nation always has?
That's a great question. The first word that would come to mind is resilience. This is a people who, this is their homeland, the Jewish people who have lived in the land of Israel going back 3,500 years consecutively. One of the things you mentioned, the Abraham Accords Caucus, one of the things that I so appreciate about the Abraham Accords, and it was Tal Becker, one of the authors of the Accords, who said this, is for the first time it recognized that both Jews and Arabs belong to the same land, and they have to find a way to live on that land. I was there in March, so 5-6 months after the attacks. The wounds were raw. The pain was palpable. You could just see the angst. At that time, there were 130 plus hostages still being held by Hamas. We stayed a couple days extra, my wife and I, and we went to Hostage Square on one of the Saturday night gatherings, calling for the release of the hostages. So it's very much there. So resilience is the first word. Pained, anguish at what's happened, concern for the future, but a strong commitment to say that Israel will survive this and Israel get to a place where they're no longer threatened by Hamas and Hamas can no longer rain terror over Gaza.
When you were in Tel Aviv at Hostage Square, did you find anger with the government, anger with the situation? One of my close relatives was there a few months ago, and she was there with member of Knesset, Mickey Levy, who is a close friend. And Mickey, of course, is the former Knesset speaker in the previous administration. And Mickey was going, tent to tent to meet with people. And the anger that he experienced when he was there was pretty intense. Of course, then the families learned that Mickey had, 2 sons fighting on the front lines, and he brought Americans. I heard that they're very happy to see Americans when they're there, but there's a lot of pain and suffering as well.
I think I had similar experiences. In March, the rallies, so there's 2 sets of rallies, right? There's the gatherings at Hashta Square, which is calling for the release of the hostages, effort to achieve a ceasefire with Hamas that removes the threat of Hamas, but also frees all of the hostages. Separately, there are protests in Tel Aviv and around the country protesting the government. And these were 2 separate things. The night that we were there, I think it was early on in the return of the protests. It was more just a sense of real need to bring the hostages home. So the families are suffering. I was there with Rubichen, whose son Itai. This was a week or 2 after they had discovered that Itai had been murdered on October 7th, but Hamas was holding his body. I was there with him and his family. And you can just feel that heaviness. I actually, after that rally, I had intended to walk over to Dizengoff Square in Tel Aviv, one of the central areas, just to get dinner with my wife. I was not aware that the rally from Hashta Square was going to then march right by Dizengoff Square. So I arrived just as the rally had changed into this march. It was a peaceful march. They were chanting, but they were walking in solidarity. There I met the family of Omer Nutra, another American hostage. Both Itai and Omer are 2 of the 8 American hostages being held. And so I walked with them for a little bit, just trying to understand what they were wanting for. I think each week the anger grows, especially as a question of Prime Minister's commitment to bringing them out. He has said he's doing everything he possibly can. We saw a little more than a week and a half ago, that Israel did put a ceasefire proposal on the table that President Biden then announced to the world. We wait for Hamas's decision on that. Each week, each day, we're 250 days or 48 days today that these people have been held hostages. And it's infants to senior citizens and everyone in between, 120 left, and we need to get them out.
We just saw an incredible situation this past weekend where Israel rescued 4 hostages. They all came back alive. They seem well. I don't know of too many countries that are able to rescue hostages. This was quite a feat by the Israelis. And yet some of the headlines internationally were pretty negative towards Israel. How do you reckon with that?
I'll be honest, I'm struggling with this reckoning. First of all, the headline, CNN was one of the examples. Hostages released. Hostages were not released. They were rescued.
And of course, Israel lost a senior member of its forces to this operation.
Right. And I was listening to NPR this morning, and they were talking about describing it as a aggressive assault by Israel. Israel went to rescue its hostages. The hostages, let's start with, they were being held in a civilian area, in a place where there's a large mall, shopping mall, there were apartment buildings. They were being held by civilian families, 2 different locations, 200 yards apart. Israel planned this. By all accounts, this was planned for months. The level of planning was extraordinary. If Israel could have gotten in, rescued the hostages, and gotten out without a firefight, civilians would not have been killed. Now, part of the civilians that are being called civilians were the captors who were holding these people hostages. Those aren't civilians. Those are terrorists by any definition of the term. Once they had freed the hostages and were trying to get out of Gaza, there was a firefight in which machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades, anti-tank weapons were being fired at the troops who had rescued these hostages. Israel did what any army, United States Army or any other army would have done, took actions to protect their soldiers and protect rescued hostages. And in that crossfire, tragically, civilians died. Civilians were killed. But let's be clear. If Hamas hadn't kidnapped these people, if Hamas hadn't held these people in civilian populations, if Hamas hadn't engaged in a firefight as Israel was rescuing their hostages, the civilians would not have been put in harm's way in the first place, would not have died, and would not have had the tragedy that it was not Israel's attack to rescue the hostages, it was Hamas's capture and holding of the hostages that's responsible for that.
You know, Congressman, one of the things that you said earlier struck me, and I think a lot of Americans don't necessarily realize the deep commitment that many Americans have to Israel. You mentioned Chicago's sister city. I have family in Cleveland, and I know Bet Shean is Cleveland's sister city. That really speaks to the U.S.-Israel relationship, and you've been at the forefront of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Can you explain how strong that bond is, but also give us a sense of that there's a perception that it may be fraying? Tell us about that.
This is also one of the things that frustrates me. I think if you look at almost all polls, they show that the U.S. population overall still supports Israel, still supports a strong Israel-U.S. relationship, recognizes Israel's right to defend itself, to protect its borders, to rescue its hostages. There's not a lot of fraying there. Is there angst within the Jewish community specifically, but also the American community at large over the numbers of civilians that have died in this war? Of course, our hearts break for all the innocent civilians that have died. But we also understand that this war was started by Hamas on October 7th, that Hamas continues to embed itself inside civilian populations, has dug tunnels with tons and tons of concrete, that rather than building schools and hospitals and industry, they've built a network of 500 miles of underground tunnels, not to protect their civilians, but to protect their terrorist infrastructure and fighters. And that's why the war continues. And that's why civilians are caught in the middle. And so I think most understand that. Israel is a strategic ally to the United States. The United States has demonstrated its commitment to Israel. President Biden has stood by Israel now longer than any president in time of war with Israel, going back to Harry Truman. But the United States is also committed to bringing this war to an end, to bringing the hostages home, to making sure Hamas can't govern and reign terror over Gaza, but that the people of Gaza, the Palestinians and the Israelis, have a path to a future that includes peace for all people, peace for the region, and one where Israelis and Palestinians can raise their children, look forward to prospects of their kids pursuing their dreams, having families of their own, and ultimately a region that is, again, going back to the Abraham Accords, this ideal of both Jews, Arabs, people of the region belonging to the same land, living on that land, and prospering on that land together.
Yeah, I should say you were also recently in Saudi Arabia.
I was.
And a lot of things, that get lost in this is that the whole region wants peace. And the whole region's struggling for peace amidst this conflict. What was it like in Saudi Arabia? And what are you hearing about the prospects for reconciliation with Israel and really the Gulf states having a larger role in a post-conflict situation in Gaza?
I've been trying to get to Saudi Arabia for a while, and even right around October 7th, I was supposed to be there, but for family reasons, I wasn't able to travel. And so this was a chance. I was invited to speak at the World Economic Forum. It was a long trip for a one-day on the ground in Riyadh. I left Friday at 6:30 from Chicago, and I was in Washington at my desk 3 o'clock on Monday. But I had that one day in Riyadh, and it was an extraordinary day. You had people from all over the world for the World Economic Forum. You had foreign ministers from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, the whole region, notably not from Israel, get to there someday. But in this forum, you have all these people. And I had the privilege of attending a working lunch where you had foreign ministers, industry leaders talking about, at that time, there was a deal on the table. Israel had accepted it. We were waiting to see if Hamas was going to accept it. It was the very end of March when I was there. Would Hamas accept the deal? Would there be a ceasefire? The conversation in that room, there was no press, there were no cameras. It was off the record, so I won't say what anyone specifically said. But as a whole, the conversation was about getting to the end of this war. Everyone talked about the war ending, making sure Hamas could no longer govern Gaza or threaten the region. But the idea that Israel would be fully a part of the future of the region was not just accepted without question. It was talked about as an opportunity and a prospect for prosperity for everybody. And so even in the midst of this war, as horrific as it has been, I think there are people around the region who are looking to a future that recognize Israel is a part of that future, and that the only way to secure a peaceful future is if everyone's working together.
And, you mentioned the deal, and there's been deals since then floated. There's a deal on the table right now. What is it going to take to get a ceasefire, to get a deal, to be able to move forward?
I can tell you the framework for ending the war tomorrow, and that would be Hamas releasing all of the captives, the hostages, 120. We know that at least 42 of them are dead, but to the people who these are their loved ones, they want their loved ones back so they can get closure and bury them. It is Hamas laying down its arms. That will bring peace. And ultimately, it's Hamas turning over Gaza, control of Gaza, to legitimate authorities that obviously is going to have to be Palestinian at its core, but at least in the beginning, it's going to require the support of our allies in the region, the Abraham Accord states, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but also the United States, Europe. And we have to make sure that we never see a situation again where Israel is threatened from Gaza with another October 7th, but the people of Gaza are presented the opportunity to build a future for their kids every bit as free and prosperous as what kids in Israel are hoping for as well.
Do you believe that the Israelis, and I know this is a hypothetical, but do you believe that they would accept an international body trying to reconstruct Gaza that includes the United States, that includes our European allies, but also that includes the partners in the Gulf?
It's a really hard thing for Israel to accept. The psychology of Israel has always been that the Israelis will defend themselves by themselves. They appreciate the help, whether it's the assistance from the United States over the years or from other countries, but they've never looked to any other nation to put boots on the ground, so to speak. And what you're talking about here is a major sea change. On the other hand, the defense minister, Gallant, has said this. Two things are certain, in his words. One is Hamas can no longer govern in Gaza. And the other is that Israel cannot govern Gaza. So it has to be something else. And that something else isn't a wave of a magic wand and it happens overnight. It has to be something that's built over time. Ultimately, it's got to be the Palestinians who are governing themselves. That may be in the form of a reconstructed or reformed Palestinian Authority. It may be something else. But to get from where we are today to where we hope to be in the future isn't just one step, but it's multiple steps up a steep slope. And in that context, I think Israelis, many in the Israeli government, not everyone, I'll come back to that in a second, recognize that they're going to need to partner with the U.S., with whether they like it or not. The UN will likely have a role in that, the EU. And then at the end of the day, who has the moral authority, who's likely to get the respect of the Palestinian people? It's got to be other Arab states from the region.
The Biden administration has said that they believe Hamas is sufficiently degraded. Do you agree with that?
Depends on what you mean by sufficient. Hamas is degraded. There were 24 battalions on October 7th, varying degree of training. The battalions that crossed over from Gaza into Israel to perpetrate the massacre, many, if not most of them, were trained by Iran, in Iran, with a level of sophistication that was equivalent to the Iranian army. This was a real army. Do I think that Hamas could do another October 7th today? No. Do I think if given the chance, would they reconstitute themselves to do another October 7th, in their words, again and again and again? 100%. And that's why this war isn't over until Hamas is no longer able to threaten Israel. There's phases of the war. We can get to a ceasefire, but the insurgency in Gaza is already taking hold. That's a part of the process. Until Gazans can govern themselves, can free themselves from Hamas, there's always going to be the threat of actions from small groups to even full battalions. Last data I had, which is now several weeks old, there were 4 battalions in Rafah and 1 or 2 estimated to be around the rest of Gaza. So definitely diminished, but the threat is not eliminated.
There's something we haven't really talked about yet. You mentioned you visited the north when you were in Israel. Israel's also facing a growing crisis to the north with Hezbollah. And what is your assessment of that situation?
So as bad as it's been in Gaza, and it's been awful for Israel, it's been awful for the people of Gaza, war with Hezbollah, it would be orders of magnitude worse. Hezbollah has hundreds of thousands of rockets and mortars. Many of those rockets are precision guided that could hit targets throughout Israel. There's been this, I don't want to call it a low burn. It's kind of a moderate burn, literally with forest fires generated by some of these rockets. But every day there's been actions from Hezbollah across the border targeting Israel, and then Israel responding, targeting Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not an affiliate of Iran. It's a full proxy. It is the best trained army. It is a war-tested military, having fought in Syria. So the threat of war in Lebanon is very real, and it would be very severe for people on both sides of the border. UN Resolution 1701 from 2006, after what was then called the Second Lebanon War, Hezbollah was supposed to be 25 kilometers north of the Litani River. That's never been fully enforced. There are negotiations to try to achieve that peacefully. The United States is desperately working to do that. The people of Lebanon desperately want to avoid a war. It's Hezbollah. It's not the people that are driving this. And as we've seen in Gaza, tragically, it would be the people of Lebanon who would suffer Hezbollah's war if that's what it comes to. So hopefully we can get to the other side and convince Hezbollah and Iran that it's not in their interest to pursue a war with Israel at this time.
Can you describe for our listeners just how close Israel is to Lebanon and to Hezbollah? And you mentioned the Litani River as the buffer, but they've clearly gone past the buffer zone. How close are they?
It's more than the closeness. At any border, you're right there. But in the borders between Israel and Lebanon, right on the border are villages and towns, Lebanese villages on the north, Israeli villages and towns on the south. In 1990, I was visiting a place called Mizgavam, which is up on a mountain overlooking the border, and you could see down into Lebanon from this high observation place. But it was right there. A few years ago in this area, they discovered tunnels that Hezbollah was digging that had actually come under the border. Israel was aware of it and was able to thwart it before any attack. But it was literally coming in meters away, yards away from the gate of these communities. Right now, Kiryat Shmona, which is on the Israeli side of the border, has been evacuated. There's 60 to 80,000 people who can no longer live in their homes because of this fighting. It's evacuated. Where I was in March, a place called Kibbutz Sasa, only 2 miles, but again on a hill. It was at the crest of a hill. So the factory at this kibbutz was still operating because it was on the south-facing side of the hill. But there were barricades. You couldn't go over the top of the hill because if you went over the top of the hill, you were exposed to sniper fire from Lebanon. And the high school, there was a community high school on this kibbutz at the very top of the hill. The auditorium had taken a direct hit from an anti-tank weapon that had gone in one wall and out the other wall of the school auditorium. They are right on top of each other. And it's not just the Israeli citizens of this region who have been evacuated, but against the Lebanese, non-Hezbollah Lebanese, one time mostly Christian, they've all cleared out for fear of what Hezbollah is doing to them. So again, these are people who have lived in this area for centuries, who could, given the chance, live peacefully together. But unfortunately, Hezbollah, Hamas, you've got the Houthis, you got the militias in Syria. The one thing unites all of them is their links to Iran, and Iran is driving in place trying to make Israel unlivable.
We've talked a lot about the tunnels in Gaza, but the tunnels in Lebanon that Hezbollah has constructed, just like their ability to fire rockets with precision, is something altogether different, isn't it?
It's very different. The first thing is in Gaza, you're on the coastal plain. So the tunnels are dug through soft earth, a lot of it's sand. And that's why there's so much concrete yet necessary to reinforce those tunnels. And you've seen it from the images. In the north, in the Galilee and the Golan, these are mountains, rocky mountains. So the tunnels are dug through rock. The reinforcement is very different. The network is very different. Hezbollah, compared to Hamas, is a well-trained army throughout, many more fighters, much more battle experience, and much more sophisticated weaponry. So the threat from the tunnels in the north are actually even more dangerous than what Israel faces in the south.
I want to turn to politics just to end here a little bit. How does partisanship in the United States, but also partisanship in Israel, threaten a path forward?
Partisanship threatens the path forward at its very core. I mentioned earlier that the relationship between the United States and Israel is a strategic relationship. It benefits the United States every bit as much as it benefits Israel. And that has been the case throughout Israel's 76-year history. You can look through it decade by decade. We need to maintain that. If you go back 30, 40 years, every time there was an issue about Israel in Congress, it got broad bipartisan support. And I've been involved with this since the 1980s. I remember the goal was always to get 400 votes. Never got everybody. There was always a handful on the left and on the right for various reasons who were antagonistic to the U.S.-Israel relationship. But overwhelmingly, people on both sides appreciated and saw the importance of that relationship. We've maintained that. October 7th happens. The first thing that Congress did when we came back, many of us, myself included, were working on a resolution supporting Israel. We got 412 votes supportive of that resolution. There's been a number of votes since. Probably the most significant one of recent was the vote for sending aid to Israel. That got 366 votes, Democrats and Republicans. And I think that's key. We need to make sure that the support for Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship remains bipartisan. So it doesn't matter if it's a Democratic president or a Republican president, who the Speaker of the House is, Republican or Democrat, the relationship between our two countries will remain strong.
And what about in Israel? There's a lot of politics in Israel, too, that Americans aren't necessarily conscious of. What's the situation in Israel? How does their partisanship threaten potential peace?
So Israel, like the United States, is a democracy. There are differences. Our government is a bicameral. You have a House and a Senate, and our Congress and the legislature is separate and distinct, with the executive branch and the judiciary, three equal branches. Israel is a parliamentary system with multiple parties that can be created overnight. And there's never been a single party with a majority in Israel, so it's always a coalition government. And if our bipartisan hyper-partisan system is messy, I think you take it to another level. And right now, there are divides that make it very difficult. If elections were held today, the Prime Minister Netanyahu's ruling coalition would probably almost certainly lose. It doesn't need to be another election for another 2+ years. The coalition that Netanyahu has put together is the furthest right coalition in Israel's history. This comes on the heels of the last government, which was the most diverse parliamentary coalition probably in any government's history. I think if elections were held today, you would end up somewhere in the middle of those two. But without the elections, you have the prime minister who's being held over a barrel by the most extremist elements of his party. I don't have sympathy for him. In prior governments, and you go back to the first Likud government in 1977, I promise you that Menachem Begin would never have allowed the people that Netanyahu has aligned himself with to be in the government. And yet, not only are those people in the government, but they have enough power over the prime minister to force their way. And that threatens Israel as it fights a battle for its existence. It threatens the U.S.-Israel relationship. So in the same way that the hyper-partisan dynamics in the U.S. is dangerous, the extreme right dynamics in Israel are dangerous as well.
Congressman, thank you so much for your time today. I hope that you'll come back, and the next time you come back, we'll have a much, much better situation to talk about in Israel and in Gaza. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Happy to come back, and I pray that the situation improves long before I come back. Let it be better tomorrow.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog